Today, my wife and I are visiting Colonial Williamsburg, an amazing living history museum in Virginia that tells the early part of America's enduring story. Come along with me and my wife as we explore a history buff's paradise. That's coming up next.
So, this is the hall of the House of Burgesses, where the elected lower house of Virginia's colonial government met. Because they were an elected body, they were considered the people's representatives, at least in theory, though they weren't democratically elected, as we think of it today. To be allowed to participate in an election, to vote, in colonial Virginia, you had to meet the same qualifications that you did to serve on a jury. You had to be an adult white male, Protestant, owned sufficient property. In fact, you could be fined for not voting. Voting wasn't really regarded as a right. It was considered a privilege and a duty. Now, when you went to your county courthouse to vote, each county elected 2 burgesses. We have 61 counties in Virginia just before the Revolution in the mid-1770s. Each electing 2 burgesses. This means you have over 120 of them potentially coming here, as often as twice a year. And they're bringing with them many, many complaints and petitions from the people of their counties. So that's a lot of petitions and complaints. They need to get through their business as quickly as possible. So they would choose one of their more popular members to act as speaker. He would sit in that chair. He actually didn't do much speaking when he was there. He wasn't even allowed to express his opinions about any issue. He was there to make certain that his colleagues observed proper rules of order when they deliberated, such as speaking only when recognized by the speaker, and not using insulting language or otherwise behaving disruptively. So they could get to their business as quickly as possible here. These elections were conducted viva voce. That means live voice. So when you went to the courthouse to vote, more often than not, the candidates themselves would be standing right there by the courthouse. You might even look the candidate in the eye and to inform them that you're voting for them. You know, of course, bowing respectfully, of course, since they're likely to be your betters. The gentlemen elected here to this lower body were essentially the same social class as those wealthy in the Point councils. They too were of the landed gentry, regarded as the governing class. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Patrick Henry, Richard Henry Lee began their political careers as elected members of this body. They were also, of course, born into that privileged landed gentry class as well. One's expected to do the governing. So, elections were face-to-face. In other words, they didn't use secret ballots in colonial elections. It's not supposed to be a secret who you're voting for. Yeah. Of course, disagreements could sometimes arise at elections on election day. Sometimes things even got physical. Brawls and fisticuffs would break out. And the fact that most of the voters were inebriated when they showed up at the courthouse would be a contributing factor to that. But that's what colonial Americans were used to, not just in Virginia. Virginia's legislature was the oldest, established in Jamestown in 1690, but it set the precedent for all the other English colonies established soon after. So these rough and tumble elections were what the colonial Americans were used to. One thing they passionately believed was that only those gentlemen they looked in the eye and voted for face-to-face should have the authority to introduce new taxes on them. By the 1700s, every British subject knew that their king was not allowed to directly impose taxes on them. The last English king who tried to do that was Charles I, and he lost his head in 1649. So that settled that question about whether the king is allowed to directly tax his subjects. But only elected legislatures then can impose new taxes on British subjects. But the question is, which elected legislature? There were a lot of them. Every English colony had one, all over the world. And of course, the mother country had its elected legislature, the House of Commons and Parliament. They believed they were elected to do what was best for the whole British Empire, not just for one particular part of it. So this also means they believed they had the authority to directly tax any British colony anywhere in the world. However, they chose not to exercise that prerogative for most of the colonial period. But everything changed in 1763 when the French and Indian War ended. That wasn't just an American war, that was a world war between the British and the French. A very expensive war. The British government was saddled with a bigger debt than they had ever had in their whole history at the end of the war. So we know what government does when they run up big debts, right? They also start imposing big taxes. So they started increasing taxes at first on Englishmen in England, to the point that some members of Parliament believed that Englishmen were being taxed at 10 times the rate per capita as British subjects in America. Well, they didn't think that was right, especially since we gained so much territory in America. All that land between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River is now British after we defeated the French. Even Canada and Florida are now British. We need extra revenue to pay for administering, securing that territory. Shouldn't Americans help pay for that? That's how they justified acts like the Stamp Act and the Townshend duties. These went over the heads of the colonial legislatures to directly tax the colonies. Revenue from, say, the Stamp Act could be sent west to pay for maintaining forts on the frontier, seemed reasonable to those members of Parliament. But the British Americans, it was anything but. We haven't met those fellows 3,000 miles across the ocean in Parliament, much less decide who we want to vote for. So we have two different interpretations of the British Constitution that are formed. Americans got pretty rambunctious in their protest against these taxes without representation. Patrick Henry, freshman Burgess, Virginia's legislature, was a major leader of these protests, especially against the Stamp Act. 1765, he proposed 7 resolves against the Stamp Act. Only 4 of them actually passed, but all 7 were published in newspapers and other colonies. So this encouraged Americans to get really rambunctious in their protests, doing things like tarring and feathering stamp distributors and tearing down their houses, drinking all their wine, attempting to bury one of them alive in one instance. So Parliament repealed the Stamp Act, tried again with the Townshend duties, import duties on certain goods. They repealed all but the duty on tea. That was the one that was raising sufficient revenue to be worthwhile. So they even lowered the duty on tea, make tea cheaper, see if they could tempt Americans into paying this tax, setting a precedent. And at first it seemed like it might work, but mid-December 1773, some fellows in Boston decided they weren't buying that anymore, and they one night destroyed 10,000 pounds sterling worth of British East Indian tea, dumping it into Boston Harbor. 10,000 pounds at this time would have been enough to pay Virginia's royal governor's salary for 5 years. Parliament was not amused when they found out. That's when they made their fateful decision to crack down on those rowdy people in Massachusetts by blockading the port of Boston and imposing what amounted to martial law in the colony of Massachusetts. And of course, in retaliation, Americans in the colonies made their decision. What's happening in Massachusetts is threatening all of us, not just Massachusetts. So we need a special Congress with delegates from every colony. It met for the first time, 1774 in Philadelphia, presided over by the same gentleman who presided over Virginia's House of Burgesses as Speaker there, Peyton Randolph. Originally, the Congress was not meant to be a government. It was an extra legal body formed the hope of bringing about a peaceful resolution of our differences with England. But when armed rebellion broke out in Massachusetts the following spring, 1775, and the hopes of a peaceful resolution started to fade, and by early 1776, many Americans were of the opinion that we might be better off if we just weren't British subjects anymore. And here in Virginia, that finally reached a critical point in May 1776, when the special convention met here and unanimously declared Virginia a free and independent state. And this is when they went to work on a new constitution. Now we have a chance to create a better government where we won't have these problems. But we have to right the wrongs of the old government first. So they drew up what they called the Declaration of Rights for that purpose, listing some of the characteristics they wanted this new government to have. They definitely had an article stating that the people should only be taxed the representatives they voted for. Another article stated that the elected representatives of the people should have the final say in the conversation about what the laws will be. Not a king, definitely not a king, or any one person for that matter. So in Virginia's 1776 Constitution, the governor had no veto power whatsoever. Just imagine our American government today, the president having no veto power at all. Let's think about that. That's what they wanted, not just in Virginia, but in the other states too, other new independent states. They wanted the legislature to have the lion's share of the power. They were really paranoid about strong executive power. So, as I mentioned earlier, separating executive, legislative, judiciary power is a big priority. They also agreed, let's get government out of the business of regulating religion. How many of you here go to church at least once a month? How many of you go to church less often than that? And we'd be paying a lot of fines. But that was mild compared to some of the other difficulties they had with religion. Virginia's Declaration of Rights later served as the most important model for the Bill of Rights, later added to the federal Constitution. And of course, in the federal Constitution, they moderated their thinking a little bit. They said, well, maybe the legislature shouldn't have that much power, maybe we need more even power. And the result was federal government, which is now with its checks and balances there. Virginia's Declaration of Rights also helped to inspire democratic revolutions in other countries, starting with France in 1789. So what these gentlemen did here has ended up shaping the history of the entire world. Continues to do so right now in the present day.
Well, that's a wrap for this Colonial Williamsburg video. I hope you really enjoyed it, getting to see another part of this amazing living history museum. If you like this sort of stuff, check out my other videos. Check out colonialwilliamsburg.org to plan your own visit here, because it's so much cooler in real life than it is on film. Till next time, this is History Buff, TN Photobug signing out, and I'm having a blast with the past.